Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast. Ozcast. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
I even love the smell of books.
Hi, and welcome to Tsundoku. I'm Kath Keneally.
And I'm Sarah Martin. This is the place where it's absolutely okay to be an addicted reader.
And by addiction, we mean you simply can't walk past a bookshop, spending an embarrassingly long time in there and often coming out with just another one or two books under your arm.
You're the kind of person who taps someone on the shoulder, interrupts their reading, and asks what's got them so engrossed.
And the pile by your bed, what the Japanese called Tsundoku, just keeps growing.
Today, our literary experts pull apart the famous Virginia Woolfe story of Mrs Dalloway, a day in the life of a high society Englishwoman in the 1920s.
How fresh, how calm, stiller than this, of course, the air was in the early morning. Like the flap of a wave, the kiss of a wave, chill and sharp, and yet, for a girl of 18, as she then was, solemn, feeling as she did, standing there at the open window, that something awful was about to happen.
And we'll also hear from another avid reader about how they acquired their passion for books.
And what they've got waiting in their tsundoku.
But right now, an author of the moment. Sarah, you caught up with Hannah Kent.
Yes, Hannah's had such a spectacular international success with her first novel, Burial Rites, which was set in the sparse landscape of Iceland. Her second novel, The Good People, she set in Ireland. And now, with Devotion, she's followed the colonial experience of settlers to the Adelaide Hills. I caught up with Hannah at Writers' Week and asked whether it was more of a challenge to write about something so close to home.
I felt ready to write about Australia. I felt ready to write about the Australian landscape particularly, and that really came from this sort of deep and abiding love I've had for it, having grown up on Paramount Country in the Adelaide Hills particularly. It's very close to my heart, and there's a real pleasure, I think, as a writer to try and distill the things that you love into prose and to see if you can honour them in that way. And I think that was really where this book was starting. But at the same time, it took me a couple of years to work up the courage to write about Australia because, with my previous two novels, one set in Iceland, one set in Ireland, I really relied on my sense of being an outsider, an outsider who's asking questions that someone who's familiar with those landscapes and cultures wouldn't ask. I felt that it gave me a unique way of looking at things, and I was able to utilise that in my writing. So, yeah, it took me a while to think, okay, this is going to be a challenge to see if I, as someone who's so deeply familiar with the Australian landscape particularly, but also to a certain extent our colonial history, if I can ask the questions of it that need to be asked, if I can approach it as if I were an outsider.
Navigating the story of bringing new immigrants, colonialising the country that we now live on, that's tricky as well, isn't it? It's charting that transition into a new space, but also into those relationships with the Paramount people, the First Nations people. How much was that playing on your mind in how you would attend to that throughout the book?
It was a huge part of my reluctance initially to set a historical novel in Australia because I had no interest in writing about our colonial history, because not for its own sake, because I think it's a time that we need to interrogate and ask questions of and judge and be critical of. But it was because as someone who is not Indigenous, who is not First Nations, I knew that I was never going to, take up that space or appropriate, that culture. That wasn't something that interested me, that I felt that was available to me or that I would be able to, had a right to. And so I knew the alternative was that if I was going to write a historical novel set in Australia, it was always going to have to be from the perspective of a settler, and I use inverted commas around that. It was going to be from the perspective of someone who was an oppressor. And as much as, of course, in any historical time period, you have people who disagree with, dominant values and thoughts, I really thought there's a greater pressure to adhere to kind of the prejudices of a time, to kind of, because it's historical fiction, it has to be true. And I had absolutely no interest in adopting those, the perspective of a racist character or of someone who thought that colonialism was even a good thing. So, for a long time it was just something that did not interest me. And it wasn't really until, I felt lured back by the promise of the landscape and also by the prospect of bringing to light things which have not necessarily been spoken about or are not necessarily recognised, namely a queer love story, the lives of women, and also, these Prussian communities who came out from Prussia because they were persecuted and then in turn enacted persecution, even if it was indirectly through, the theft of resources and land. That I thought, okay, there's something here, maybe I can write a kind of story set in this time period. But for a long time it was just something I was not interested in doing, because I didn't feel like a story like that would serve anyone, and I thought, if anything, I was just going to perpetuate the worst of colonialism.
You certainly haven't done that, though, in grounding this so firmly in a story of true love. It really transcends all of that, and I found it such an inspiring read to have that really shameless and, genuine devotion, there's the name, experience as a reader, to just have that person sitting in a moment with true love and charting that journey without question. It's been a joy.
Oh, thank you. That's so lovely to hear. Yeah, absolutely. I feel like this book really didn't find its heartbeat. Charlotte Wood, the writer, talks about heat seeking when you're researching and writing a novel. You're trying to find that which is alive in a book or in a story. And it wasn't really until I sort of decided to pursue a queer love story, or a love story more generally, at the heart of this book, that I felt like everything else, all my other qualms and concerns and ethical considerations, could be sort of alleviated by centering this. And I felt like, okay, this is it. This is the heartbeat of the novel. And alongside my decision to center a love story between two women in this book was basically a follow-up decision to just not allow shame to degrade it in any way, whether that be the shame of the characters about their own feelings, or the shame of a community, or shame put upon them. I wanted to really be able to write a book of queer joy, essentially. And that's not to say that the book doesn't have its sad moments, because of course it does, but that was the challenge I set myself within this particular historical context.
It's evidence through your other books as well as this that you do a great depth of research. What is your approach to preparation for writing?
I never really set out to be a writer of historical fiction, so research wasn't ever something that I really knew how to do. I sort of fell into it when I decided to write about Agnes Magnusdottir because I was interested in her as a person, but of course there was a much broader historical context around her story, and I needed to understand that in order to understand her. And so I started researching, and not really knowing what to do, not being a historian, I just kind of read indiscriminately. I remember with that book I read, everything from very dry academic articles on statistics of smallpox in Scandinavia and Nordic countries to recipe books, to songs, to other fiction. If anything had to do with Iceland at that point of time, I read it. And of course, as time went on, I was able to research her story as well in greater specificity. So that was sort of something that I worked out as I did it, but I had thought that I would have like a series of questions and that I would research and eventually find out these answers. But what I realized in the process of writing that book and encountering research like that for the first time was that research offered me so much creative inspiration. It's a process of discovery, not just kind of this very clinical, I have a question, I shall find out the answer. You just end up discovering a lot more questions, really. But I found it, as I said, very inspiring, very creatively motivating, and I found that it really informed so much more of the book than what I had anticipated. And so it seemed a very natural thing to continue with. And to this day, I really enjoy research. I still have that same kind of indiscriminate approach where I will look at recipe books and proverbs and religious texts and academic articles and maps and surveys and anything, censuses, all this sort of information, if it's just set around that time or I feel like it might have been relevant to my characters. And that's probably the greatest thing. It has to be relevant to the time or the cultures or the life experiences my characters would have been undergoing. Then I read it. So I don't write while I'm researching like I know many other writers do. I tend to do all my research first till I feel saturated with familiarity, and then I write out of that understanding.
In writing about German Lutheran settlers that have essentially come to the Adelaide Hills, I'd imagine your resources in situ were quite abundant.
There were so many, and in fact that was one of the things that I knew that I would have less trouble than with my previous books, where there was just no information available specifically about those characters, but also more general information of, say, about women, working class, all that sort of stuff. But with this book, yes, there is so much, because so many of these families who emigrated now have descendants who are very aware of their lineage, who have preserved family records, preserved letters. There was so much information, and that was one of the things that quite early on made me realise that I was going to have to step away from the research and kind of not be as loyal to the historical record if I wanted to write a book of fiction. Because if I had sort of ensured that every character's name was correct, all the dates were right, I was going to write sort of a parochial history of the area. So I knew that I needed to essentially fictionalise it all. Otherwise, I was going to get a lot of very angry emails from, people in Harndorf and the Brosser saying, my great-great-great-grandfather didn't do this or wasn't called that. Yeah, so it was actually quite freeing in that regard. But I still spent a lot of time researching, particularly things like the boat journey from Hamburg to Port Adelaide, some of the early experiences, anything where I felt there was also an ethical need, or a need to be ethical, an ethical line to walk. That's when I would refer back to sources from that time, because I do think it's important to still ensure that there's an integrity to your work, and especially in terms of representing culture particularly.
How do you write? Is it morning? Is it night? Is it you hide yourself away? What's your process?
I ask myself that question at the beginning of every book. I forget between books. It's a new process every time. I'm very lucky. Devotion was written slightly differently, because with this book I now had 2 young children, 2 newborns, and I was breastfeeding and trying to type at the same time, all that kind of gear. But my first 2 books I was quite rigorous. I was very disciplined. I had a time I liked to start. I would sit down at my desk at 8:30 in the morning, and I would write 1,000 words when it came to a first draft, once I'd completed my research. And then I would start the process again, and I'd have very clear, definitive drafts. With this book, I was just writing when I could, and it was massively interrupted. You've got kids' cartoons sounding from the other side of the wall, not the perfect silence required of, to sort of inhabit a historical period. But I guess the fundamentals of my writing remain the same. I predominantly write on a desktop computer at a desk, and I try to get 1,000 words a day when I'm trying to get that first draft done, because I know that even if it's terrible and they're all going to be cut, by the end of 100 days I'm going to have 100,000 words, and that's something then to return to. Yeah.
Did you know your characters from the outset?
With this book, perhaps my protagonist Hannah, I feel like she didn't really change very much over the drafting process, and also Taya. I felt that I came to understand them as characters. They sort of arrived within the context of their love for each other and what they saw in each other, and I could lean on that as a cornerstone in further developing their characters. But a lot of the secondary characters changed a great deal throughout it, particularly, Hannah's family, and that came about as a necessary redrafting and consideration of plot and the themes that I wanted to explore. But I often feel that my main characters arrive as they are, and they don't really change. Often I feel like a draft truly begins once I can nail voice, and I'll write something, and it doesn't always make it into the novel, but I will write something, and it will kind of become like an anchor point for me. If I ever become unsure of who my character is, or what they sound like, or what they want, I can return back to this writing. And for Hannah, the protagonist in Devotion, it's essentially the first paragraph of the book. I wrote that one day, and it hasn't changed since I wrote it, and that was always what I returned to kind of remind myself of who she was and how she saw the world.
You touch on the concept of, is it synesthesia, the sounds that people hear in colours or in nature. Did you do some separate research into that, or is it personal experience? I don't know.
It's so funny you ask that, because I've referred to it as synesthesia, but when I was writing the book I never considered it as such. For me it was much more about this fact that this young girl, she identifies herself as not being separate from nature. She's a part of it, and it speaks to her, and she recognises within nature a divinity that the rest of her community and her congregation only really recognise in God. And so it all grew out of, these interests and this idea that the difference that marks her and separates her out from her family and from her community really comes from this ability within her to, I guess, assimilate with nature in a spiritual sense. that, without too many spoilers in the book, also becomes meaningful later on. But yeah, it was only really once the book was done that I was like, oh, it's basically synesthesia. That's her experience of nature. But at the time of writing, I think my head was much more in a space of exploring the spiritual qualities of being able to truly hear it, or being sung to by trees, or just relating to the world in a way that is different to everyone else around you.
Was it in any way a device also to connect with the Paramount people, because I felt like that brought her closer to a degree with that communion with country and with land that is experienced by First Nations people?
Again, I think that was happy accident. Maybe on a subconscious level, that was something that I was exploring. But once I'd sort of established, these qualities that she had and the way that she related to the landscape, all those scenes were already, still in Prussia. They were yet to emigrate. And then when I came to those later scenes with the Paramount people, and I was considering a relationship to country and a devotion to country, of course I was like, oh, I've already, this is all here. So I think it was probably one of those things that, on a subconscious level I was considering. But I mean, you recognize these things, right? You recognize patterns in your work and concerns that pop up again. You recognize that you've seeded stuff that you didn't realize you were doing earlier on. And that's what I think the revision and rewriting process can be about, is really kind of thinking, okay, yeah, this is good. I'm going to bring these patterns to the fore and make more of them, because I think they do speak to that sort of subconscious interest that is so much at play in a first draft.
Do you sometimes get to the end of that first draft and do your review of it and get a real surprise by something that you didn't see emerging throughout?
Oh yeah, I get it once the book's published that I don't realise. I mean, I don't read my work once it's published because I just want to edit it. But readers will come to me and be like, I really loved yada yada yada, and I'll be like, oh yes, that is what I intended to do, and and of course it makes sense. But sometimes, and the best people for that are students. When burial rights was on the curriculum in several states, I had some fantastic emails and communication with students who, had just done the most marvelous interpretations, or understanding of the various uses of symbols, for instance, in that book, that I had no idea I was doing. But then they pointed it out to me. I'm like, absolutely, that's a totally legitimate interpretation of the work. And I'm a firm believer that the writer only writes half a book, right? The reader finishes it. So it's a joy when people give you that kind of feedback, and you can pretend to take credit for having that kind of,
that was
deep
planned.
running concern. Yeah, no, a lot of it. So, I mean, writing is such a weird thing, right? I mean, I'd never try to mysticize the creative process, but there are absolutely times where you don't completely understand what exactly it is that you're doing. Sometimes you feel like you're in control, but sometimes, you're not.
And do you think if you were giving some recommendations to writers to hone their craft, would it be around that thing about just slog it out to start with and then fine tune, or have you got other things that you would guide people with?
Every book is your first book, right? One book doesn't teach you how to write the second. But the thing that does help me is to trust in process. And by process, what I mean is just showing up, just rocking up to the desk and just do the work, that's what it is. Talent is, fantastic, but I actually think it's widely abundant, and I think you can foster it, but in the end, it doesn't actually count for much if it's not getting you your fingers on the keys. And I think that's the doing of it is what teaches you. Ultimately, that's what makes you better. So I think, just show up and do the work. It's really kind of pedestrian, but it's true, and it's true of so many things as well.
What's the process in being, getting your work out there?
Look, I had a really fortunate pathway to publication. I was writing burial rights. It wasn't called that at the time, but I was writing it as part of a PhD in creative writing. So I thought, it would be read by an examiner and maybe my mum, I don't know. And then one of my supervisors encouraged me to submit it to an unpublished manuscript award, which sadly is defunct. It was the Writing Australia Unpublished Manuscript Award, which promised, I think, $5,000 and a mentorship with an Australian writer. And I think my supervisor suggested that to me because she wanted me to do a second draft, and I used the deadline as impetus. So I did. I spent about 2 weeks stripping out 20,000 words from this very messy first draft, and I submitted it, and I was very fortunate to win. And with that then came an opportunity to be introduced to an agent, Pippa Masson at Curtis Brown, and she had the faith to take me on. In the meantime, I was continually revising the work, and I had a brief but very memorable mentorship by Geraldine Brooks, brief only because she lives in America, and she gave me some wonderful insight, so I was able to continually work it, and then she sent it out to publishers in Australia, my agent. And then, there was a few who were interested, and then it ended up going to auction. So, I mean, it was a very charmed pathway. I was very, very lucky. But, there are many different pathways, but I do think that being able to put my work out there and enter it into award. I think awards are incredible ways for young writers to be noticed and also often to receive good feedback on your writing. Often judges will be very generous in that sense.
I've seen that your name has been on lists of mentorships before, associated with various awards and prizes. How valuable is that to have one of your peers or somebody you look up to spend some time with you and give you some guidance?
Oh, I think it's hugely valuable. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a mentorship. I think if there's someone who is willing to engage with your work seriously and listen to you and your desires for what you hope it is or hope it could be one day, and then to have those conversations or be a sounding board or offer some editorial insight, that's an incredible gift, because you can never be a reader, not really, of your own work. I think Margaret Atwood once said that, how the rabbits are smuggled into the hat. So you never come to it with fresh eyes. And so having the gift of a reader who is serious and engaged and can bring that, a complete lack of subjectivity to it is really important. I would absolutely encourage people to allow readers of their work, perhaps not from draft one, but when you're at a point where you recognise that there are problems but you no longer know how to fix them, I think that's often a good stage to let someone read it. And a mentorship is wonderful because you're dealing with someone who has often been where you are and understands the difficulties and the challenges and can be empathetic and compassionate and also has a wealth of experience that they can draw on. Yeah.
Who do you read and why?
Oh, that's the hardest question of all, because I read all sorts of things and it changes over the years. When I was 17, I was like such a snob and I was interested in capital L literature, and so I thought that meant I had to read all the Russians, all the dead Russians. So that's what I did. And now, of course, I'm much older and wiser, and what that means is that I read all sorts of things across different genres. I have writers that I read because I feel that they have a bearing on my own approach to writing, and I have writers I read just for the pleasure of reading. But in terms of books that I really felt were important to me in the last couple of years, are writers like Max Porter, who wrote Lanny and Grief is a Thing with Feathers. I love Sebastian Barry for his lyrical style, Days Without End. That's just one of the most extraordinary books. I just loved it so much. I finished it and wanted to read it all over again. There's some incredible Australian poets who I really enjoy reading. I read a lot of poetry, actually. And originally I wanted to be a poet. It would have been a terrible one, but I still love poetry for its ability to evoke such emotional depth with so few words. And I think it really is a wonderful reminder of the power of literature. Oh God, I don't know. I could just sit here forever. There's been this amazing glut of incredible debuts at the moment. I was speaking to Diana Reid the other day, who wrote Love and Virtue. I thought that was an incredible debut.
Phenomenal, yeah.
Phenomenal. S.J. Norman released Permafrost's collection of ghost stories, which sort of queers the gothic, and it was just really extraordinary and exciting. I don't know. You need to let me run loose in a bookshop and I will just create piles upon piles of all the books that influenced me. But it's so hard to think of in the moment. But yeah, there are many. I always feel very lucky as a reader.
Well, that's what Sonduku is all about, is those piles that we want to read, that we have read, but we want to get back to, and all of those things. And I really appreciate you sharing your story, a little taste of devotion without giving any spoilers, which is wonderful, and your time. Thanks, Hannah.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
Author Hannah Kent there, speaking with me about her latest novel, Devotion. Kath, you've read Devotion. What's your reflection?
I was very happy to go along with Hannah Kent on all of her flights of fancy and genuine literal flights of her people from Germany to Australia, with the possible exception of the very last bit, but I know I'm not alone there.
I think it's one of those that challenges people who like literature but then don't necessarily like some magic thrown in.
See how you feel. And from something new to something old. Published nearly a century ago, Virginia Woolfe penned a novel about one day in the life of society matron Clarissa Dalloway. Our literary experts Lisa Bennett and Kylie Cardell are back. They're both senior lecturers in creative writing at Flinders University and enjoyed digging back into this classic.
Summarising this book is a difficult thing because of the style, which we'll get to in a moment, but essentially it's the story of one day in Clarissa Dalloway's life where she is preparing for a party, and in this day she encounters friends, from the past, and we dip into other stories from other characters' perspectives. It's set in London just after World War I, and that changes the tone of everybody's experience of life at that time.
Kylie, why do you love this book, and why would you say it's a classic?
I think it might be the classic of classics for me. I adore this book, but it's also very challenging, and that might also be why I think it's worth reading. It's a very unusual style, and Woolfe was very experimental in thinking about this book, and she worked very hard on it, and she spends a lot of time in her diaries of the time actually reflecting on what's working and not. The book is written in a style called stream of consciousness, so we have access to the characters' thoughts as they feel them and as they think them, and it's a really hard thing to do. So I think it's a classic because she really does capture that feeling of having a lot of loose, disconnected thoughts that we all experience throughout the day. I think she does an incredible job of doing this.
Yeah. Well, I know when I first arrived at the book, you suggested that we should read it. I had never read it. I hadn't seen the movie, The Hours, or the original movie that was made. I think it was 1997. There was a Vanessa Redgrave movie.
I've never seen that.
Yeah,
She doesn't look like Mrs. Dalloway in my mind.
I hadn't read any reviews. A good friend of mine just said to me, "This is my favourite book. You are going to love it." So I went to the library, I got my copy, I hopped into bed, I went to read it. I read the first page and I thought, what the hell just happened? And I read it again and I thought, I don't think I'm really going to like this book. What's happening? And so then I thought, no, too many good people have told me it's a good book, keep going. So what do you think was happening to me, Lisa, when I read that first page?
I think that the problem is when you first encounter the first page, you expect the narrative to clearly take you from A to B. On the first page, we'll get introduced to a character and the setting, and we'll understand why we're there. But the style of this book jumps from the past to the present. Like Kylie was saying, it goes into people's different thoughts in other people's minds, all within the same long sentence. So I've found that to get used to the style, it's actually really useful to read it aloud because it forces you to slow down a little bit, and then you can notice when the tense shifts from the present to the past. And when, this happens in the very first paragraph where we're introduced to Clarissa Dalloway, and within that first paragraph, she then goes back into memories from when she was an 18-year-old. And it can be so off-putting when you first read it because it's not clear, and you're used to reading books that go, I'm trying to make this easy for you.
Do you want to read a little bit of the opening maybe and show us how it should be heard?
Okay, so this is the very first page, the very opening. Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself. For Lucy had her work cut out for her. The doors would be taking off their hinges. Rumpelmeyer's men were coming. And then, thought Clarissa Dalloway, what a morning, fresh as if issued to children on a beach. What a lark, what a plunge! For so it had always seemed to her when, with a little squeak of the hinges, which she could hear now, she had burst open the French windows and plunged at Burton into the open air. How fresh, how calm, stiller than this, of course, the air was in the early morning, like the flap of a wave, the kiss of a wave, chill and sharp, and yet, for a girl of 18, as she then was, solemn, feeling as she did, standing there at the open window, that something awful was about to happen, looking at the flowers, at the trees with the smoke winding off them, and the rooks rising, falling, standing and looking until Peter Walsh said, musing amongst the vegetables, was that it? I prefer men to cauliflowers. Was that it? He must have said it at breakfast one morning when she had gone out onto the terrace. Peter Walsh. He would be back from India one of these days, June or July, she forgot which, for his letters were awfully dull. It was his sayings one remembered, his eyes, his pocket knife, his smile, his grumpiness, and, when millions of things had utterly vanished, how strange it was, a few sayings like this about cabbages. How far does this go?
We've just been around the world and back, haven't we?
Yeah. Oh, and it's so beautiful. The language is so lovely. And
that fresh as issued
to children on a beach. Oh.
There are some one-liners in this book that almost make me cry.
Me too.
I think they are perfect. Actually perfect sentences.
I've got one here that I wrote about. It's a moment where Clarissa thinks she can understand something from a male's point of view. And it's just a fleeting insight, and then it's gone. And she writes, "Then for that moment she had an illumination, a match burning in a crocus, an inner meaning almost expressed. But the close withdrew, the hard softened. It was over, the moment." So then she talks about a match burning in a crocus. So you can picture this little lantern of an idea that you see perfectly, but then it's gone. And I just thought it must have been exhausting for her to write this book.
And I think one of the pleasures of it is very symbolic and poetic, and a lot of the sentences you have to go with as you might follow someone's thoughts, and we're going to get somewhere eventually. Yeah. And you're not always sure why you're being given the image you're given or what it means. And I think we want to know what these things mean, and maybe the thinker doesn't know, and maybe that's part of the point.
So do you think you can read the book too closely?
I think that you can, make yourself quite stressed by thinking you need to interpret and understand every single line. If you think of it more like poetry, where in poems the point is sometimes to let the language wash over you and to be transported with feeling, even if you can't actually put into words what that feeling might be. Yeah. And I think for all of us who've had a memory, to put a memory into words is really, really hard.
Kylie, how unique was this at the time? The book was first published in 1925. Had anyone been writing like this before?
Well, stream of consciousness has been invented in the late 19th century, so it exists. And then there's people like James Joyce who's writing Ulysses, which comes quite close in, also set over the span of one day. So this kind of temporality is really important in the story as well. So she's not maybe the first to do it, but she's amongst a small group, and I think certainly, to my mind, is the best at doing it.
Yeah, I can imagine that readers, when this first came out, would have found it confronting and hard to read the same way that we do. Although in that period they may have felt more in the kind of cultural moment, they might have resonated with the World War I experience a little bit more and recognized some of those deep feelings that are being expressed. But I mean, for me, I completely agree with what you're saying, Kylie, about the poetic imagery and letting it wash over you. There are some things you just won't get. I have read this book about 10 times, I think, and I still don't understand what the airplane is doing at the beginning, for instance, and what the letters are that it's spelling out in the sky. I have no idea. But then there are other things like...
or the spring bubbling up in Regent's Park.
Yes.
Like, is that
turmoil
primeval
underneath?
Time? Or
But then there's images like the leaden circles dissolving in the air. Every time, line. Me too. Every time Big Ben sounds, the leaden circles dissolve into the air.
So she's describing the chime of the bell.
She's making a visual image of the sound, and then that comes back as a chorus throughout, and so you can kind of feel, even if you don't get what that means, you still get, leaden circles dissolving. How evocative, and you think, how does it relate to what's going on? And so I think that it's actually a book that gets better and better each time you read it. Each time you reread it, you think, I didn't really notice how many times flowers are mentioned. And I didn't really notice, how many times Peter Walsh plays with his pocket knife and things like that. And you kind of think, that just adds so much more meaning. So I don't actually think you can read too much into this book, but I don't think you have to the first time you read it in order to enjoy it. But I think the more you read it, the more slowly you read it, the more times you read it, the better and better it gets. And then you become devoted to it the way that we are.
And I must say, as a newcomer to the book, at first I thought, holy heck, but by the end of it, I was thinking, I'm not going to stop. I want to stay here. And for me, I would recommend to people to read it in 1 or 2 sittings, just so that you can really let it wash over you. Don't try to follow it too closely. Just find out where you're going. Why are we following this day of Clarissa Dalloway's and Septimus Smith's?
And permission not to understand.
Yeah,
like, people are intimidated by classics just because a whole lot of critics said this is what it means.
Yes.
Doesn't mean for you there might be something else that they haven't picked up on. And I think that's the beauty and wonder of literature.
Lisa Bennett and Kylie Cardell there speaking with Michaela Andreev about Mrs Dalloway by Virginia Woolfe.
This is Sundoku, and we're all about people who can't say no to another book.
I'm Matilda and I'm 10 years old and I live in Perth.
What do you like about reading?
Well, I like getting truly involved in a book and just diving into the pages and getting lost in your own world and just being caught up and you forget the time and just read. The first proper novel I remember reading was probably the first Harry Potter book. That was the first novel I really got into, and then I started reading many more books. My favourite place to read is probably in my bed, propped up against a pillow and a lamp, or on my desk, like when I'm doing homework. Sometimes when I'm meant to be doing homework, I start reading a book and then, and I forget to do my homework, but... Books that I love at the moment are Jacqueline Harvey. She's a really good writer. She writes Alice Miranda. I also like... There's a series of 3 books called Morgan Crow, and the first one's called Nevermore, and they're big books, but I really like them. And I also like Harry Potter. Morgan Crow and Nevermore and stuff, and Harry Potter, that's kind of fantasy and magic and like adventures and stuff and finding out about your past. And then the Jacqueline Harvey books are more just about adventures and detectives and stuff like that.
Thanks for listening to Sundoku. I'm Sarah Martin.
And I'm Kath Keneally. Join us next time. This podcast is produced by 4 book addicts refusing treatment.
Sarah Martin.
Annie Hastwell. Michaela Andreev.
And me, Kath Keneally. Our thanks to composer Quincy Grant for the music. If you want to find out more about the books and authors featured in this program, check out the show notes. And you can find us on Facebook and Instagram at SundokuCast, which is TSUNDOKU Cast.